Good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me? Hello? Am I live? Well, I know I'm alive, but am I live? You can hear me at the back. Thanks, Christina. Okay, great. Thanks for coming. This is our first event of it was like new school term. It's like the new year. And this is the first event of our year. And it's really exciting. I'm not going to stay too long because we're going to get into the fun of the evening. I want to thank Linklaters for providing this and for Jamie Wotton in particular for sponsoring this event. It's really great. It's a great space. I think we had an event here last year and it went really well, so no pressure. So I'll very briefly give you the backstory to this, why we're doing this. Last year, I don't know whether you remember, and hi online, if you're watching online, hello online. We did an event. Tom Stoppard very kindly allowed us to have the UK premiere of his monologue, Penelope, which is a really funny and touching imagining of how Penelope was thinking and feeling as she was waiting for her beloved Odysseus to return. And we then had a panel discussion afterwards with Sir Tom, interviewed by Martha Carney and assisted ably by Dr. Emma Greensmith, who's here. And she was such a star on that evening that I chased her down and said, you have to do something for Classics Are All. And she came up with this brilliant idea, which she will now explain. So please, a big round of applause for Emma Greensmith.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. And Chase Down is absolutely right. So my job is very minimal tonight. It's, well, to echo Jimmy's thanks to everyone for being here, both in person and online, and to introduce the concept behind my brilliant idea, or my brilliant idea behind the concept. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, paint a mental picture so that you can have a visualization behind the wonderful pieces of rhetoric that you're about to hear, and then give you a tiny bit of overview about the format. So, mental picture first. You're not at Linklaters. It is a great space, but you're in a better space. Picture the Aegean Sea. Do it. It's blue. It's quiet. It's glistening. It's perfect. And on the Aegean Sea, there's a single boat. And on that boat, there is, amazingly and anachronistically, a set of 4 characters from, broadly speaking, classical antiquity. There's Oedipus. I'm going to have to do a lot of scare quotes in this next bit. Oedipus, king of Thebes. Helen of Troy, whose fate also launched 1,000 ships. Romulus, founder of Rome. And Hadrian, actual emperor, so I don't need to do any scare quotes, who had a beard. So these 4 are chilling and having a great time and talking about, oh yeah, you married your mother, oh yeah, well I kind of married Paris. And then, as always happens, if you give it about half an hour in a classical plot, a storm hits, because plots can't move on without a storm. A storm hits. It's immediate, it's sudden, it's devastating, and it's irrevocable. And it becomes quickly apparent that this boat, which was delicate and just about evenly poised as it was, is not going to survive this storm with its current weight. So, in order for it to lurch its way to shore, it has to lose at least one of its passengers. And so the question becomes, in a sort of Moby Dick way, who out of these 4 is going to be sacrificed to save the majority? So that question is what we are posing to you tonight. And behind me, you'll find another 4 of a different type of star of the classical world, all incredible scholars, lovely colleagues and friends whom I chased down, and all round good guys. But tonight, actually, they're going to be showing their nastier side. So rather than, they're all going to be speaking on behalf of one of those characters, Helen, Romulus, Oedipus, or Hadrian. But rather than trying to persuade you why their character deserves a place on the boat and should make it to shore, they're going to do the opposite. They're going to talk about why their character is so abhorrent, so problematic, so overrated, so unnecessary, that the classical world would be better off without them. And so they should be cast overboard and consigned to a watery death so that the other three can make it back to safety and back to our canon, our legacy. So basically, this is a balloon debate turned on its head and flipped over and twisted. It's not in the air, it's in the sea. And it's not in arguing in favour of someone who should stay, but in favour of someone who should be cast away. So that's, I hope, I know it's a horrible pun, but I hope that's whetted your appetite. Didn't plan it, just came to me, didn't stay up till 2 in the morning thinking about it. Hope has whetted your appetite for what's to come. Brief, before I hand over to the main event, brief word on structure. After I shut up, the 4 speakers are going to make their pitch one after the other. We're going to go in roughly chronological order, which I'm sure lots of classicists would love to debate, in terms of when this figure would have existed, been configured, yada, yada, to be punctuated only by a very brief introduction from me. So they're going to make their cases one after the other. They'll then, at the end, have a chance to do one final plea to remind you, to urge you, to beg you of why their figure should be cancelled. And then Jimmy's going to come back on and open the vote. And the vote is available to both people online and in person. And so without further ado, enjoy. This is going to be a vicious, verbally vicious, pugnacious, mad, probably chaotic and exciting ride. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I will now do technology and click to our first figure to be cast aboard, which is Oedipus, and our first anti-campaigner, Dr. Adrian Kelly, who will not escape without an introduction. So Dr. Adrian Kelly is Associate Professor of Classics at Oxford and Tutor and Fellow of Balliol. He did his undergraduate and master's degree at Melbourne before coming over to Oxford to do his PhD. He has published intimidatingly widely and brilliantly on Greek literature and is famous for packing out the room for his Homer lectures. He has recently edited a Cambridge Companion to Sappho, which I'd recommend. It's great and big and greatly big and bigly great. And he is finishing I've been told to use that tense, and much anticipated and undoubtedly to be brilliant commentary on Iliad 23, one of the most underrated, but I'm assured brilliant books of the Iliad. So, but Adrian's talking about none of those things tonight. He's actually going to be talking against Oedipus Rex. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. Can everybody hear me? I assume that I'm on. Okay, right, great. The reason I worked on Iliad 23 is, as you can tell from my voice, I'm an Australian, and so sport is really the only thing that they let us into the country for. So it's my job this evening to get you guys to ditch Oedipus. But unlike defendants in the Athenian courts, I'm not going to try getting on your side. I'm not going to praise your wisdom or your famed sense of justice. And not just because most of you are English. Instead, I'm going to make it as difficult as I can for myself. And I'm going to annoy you. Now, I'm doing this basically to test your honesty. It's not a function of my personality. It's not a function of the fact that I come from Balliol, or as it is increasingly known, the petri dish from which Boris Johnson has emerged. The master of my college would be really happy with that. Anyway, and the even worse fact that I am an Australian cricket fan. But I want you to vote for the expulsion of Oedipus because you recognise how right that is, despite how unpleasant I am and how poor my speech is going to be. I'm doing all of this for your moral good. And the way that I'm going to do it is this. Oedipus is a lot like Johnny Bairstow. Now, I can tell from that laughter that at least this is a relatively cricket-knowing crowd. Thank Christ for that. All right, good. So, Oedipus is, as I said, a lot like Johnny Bairstow, the England wicketkeeper. Now, the background to this story is that earlier this year in the Test match at Lord's, in fact, on the day that I was there, it was great, he was given out. He was dismissed in what was, for English people, a terribly unsporting way. That is, he missed the ball, he left his crease, and then he was given out, run out. Now, the rest of the world didn't actually care, but English people did because they thought this was typical Australian cheating. Now, but what matters here really is the fact that Bairstow then put on a sulk of almost nonnon proportions for those of us who deal with nonus. Indeed. Sorry, that's a bit of an in-joke for two of the people up here. Now, Bairstow's own form in the series had been terrible, right? He'd been just awful. And largely because he'd been recovering from a broken leg. Do you see the link yet? Oedipus, swollen foot, Bairstow, broken leg. I thought that was pretty good, personally, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But that somehow just wasn't relevant. And so he continued to sulk and to pout. At one point later in the series, a reporter had the temerity to ask him how his leg was doing. And Bairstow smirked at the journo and said churlishly that it was the first time that he'd asked him how he was feeling all series. Now, aside from the typically engaging charm which seems to be characteristic of Yorkshire cricketers, what really came across here was the massive sense of entitlement, the lack of acknowledgement of his own failings and frailties in the performance of his job, which up until that time had been pretty shit, even of a journo's very right to question that fact. So we have a figure with huge levels of self-regard, a somewhat petulant manner when he's faced with underlings, and nonetheless a decent past record to fall back on, and the hope that he might do it again later. Which he did, to his credit. Now this, I contend, is the cocktail of unpleasantness that we face in Oedipus. And I'm basically going to concentrate here on the Oedipus as he's drawn in Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus. Now he had some other problems too, because as Tom Lehrer noted, he really loved his mother. But we'll come back to this later. So the play opens in Thebes, where the city is suffering from a plague. And it turns out that the source of that plague is none other than Oedipus himself, the ruler, and specifically because he killed his dad and married his mum. So Sophocles' drama is about the discovery of past crimes rather than the commission of new ones. And we watch everyone on stage, his wife/mother, always a happy title, his cousins, and the people at large come to terms with the fact that their leader is actually almost as dodgy as Russell Brand. Too soon, yeah? And, as always with these sorts of people, see how topical we are, Oedipus and his not-so-secret past are the central issues. We learn, apparently, that he was originally from Corinth, that he went to Delphi to consult the oracle about his parentage, and this happened after some drunken dickhead called him a bastard one night in what Oedipus thought was his dad's palace. And he was told by the god Apollo there that he would kill his father and procreate with his mother. Now, on getting this unsettling news, he resolved never to return to Corinth and travel to Thebes. On the way, he went all road rage on some random old man, actually his father Laius, king of Thebes, and his whole retinue. He arrived in the newly suspiciously kingless Thebes, defeated the Sphinx by answering her riddle, and then married the recently dead king's wife, Iocaste. The rest, as they say, is history. So in a story like this, full of coincidence and tragic irony, a lot of reasonable people, and scholars too, feel sympathy for Oedipus. They say he shows concern for his people. He is an unwitting victim of fate, that he cannot know who his father was when he met him on the road from Delphi. He couldn't possibly realise that Iocaste, the dead king's wife, was his mum. All true. But Sophocles doesn't give a shit for all of that. And I think he goes to some lengths to make us look very closely at Oedipus's character. And firstly, although we can never be sure whether the play titles that we have actually correspond to the ancient play titles, it seems to be significant that This play is called the Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the Tyrant, or the Autocrat if you don't like the loading of the term tyrant. Oedipus is a sole ruler with virtually unlimited power, and these were dangerous people in the socio-political discourse of Greece, certainly in Athens, in Sophocles' day. Despite that, things start off in the play relatively well. When Oedipus first appears to universal crowd acclaim, he is the great hero leader, somewhat Stalin-esque, assuring them that he has already thought of a solution to the plague afflicting the community. The crowd looks to him for guidance and solutions, and the prominence of his intellect is clear. He tells the crowd that even before the action starts, he'd ordered his kinsman in a different sense to the way that he thought of it, of course, Creon, off to Delphi to find out from Apollo what they ought to do. And he can later tell the chorus that he had already thought of the idea of consulting the wise seer Tiresias before they had even suggested it to them. Just as when he'd been answering the Sphinx's riddle, so in this play, he's generally the guy with the best words and the highest IQ, like the Orange Man. And he's not afraid to use either. But given this massive, massive brain, his decision-making is actually pretty piss poor. Think about it. You've gone to Delphi to find out who your parents are, and you're told instead that you're going to kill your dad and marry your mum. What do? Well, getting away from home sounds like a good plan, and that's what he does. But he already had some doubts about who his parents were, because he wasn't quite sure that his Corinthian parents, Polybus and Merope are their names, were his real parents. So getting away from Corinth turns out not to be so smart. Understandable, perhaps, but not clever. But then he meets a group of people on the road who try to push him off it. He loses his shit and he kills them all. He thinks. And this is just really, really dumb. So you've been told you're going to kill your dad. You're already uncertain about who that person might actually be. And on the very day that you're told what you're going to do, you come across someone old enough to be your father, who looks a little bit like you, who is a royal like you are, and you kill him. That's a brain fart. Okay. Now the same goes for the marriage, surely. You've just been told by Apollo that you're destined to marry your mum. And your plan is to forget entirely your own recent doubts about who that person may or may not be, okay? And instead avoid the person that you think is your mum. So you leave home. Fair enough. On the face of it, not a terrible plan either. Once more, it's understandable. It's not very clever. But then to go to a nearby city, marry the dead king's wife, a woman who's old enough to be your mother, all because you want the kingdom that goes with her hand in marriage. And in a culture where marriage is typically contracted with very young women, that's another brain fart. Now, it's not as much of a brain fart as walking out of your crease, Johnny, but it's still one. All right. Now, why does he do these things? Well, the marriage, I think it's pretty clear. It's got something to do with the throne and Oedipus' sense that he just has a right to power. In that, he's kind of like the conservative front bench. But I'm going to focus here on the parasite. Oedipus tells us that he lost his rag when he was pushed off the road and that Laius and his men did not pay an even price for what they had done. Does Oedipus get angry elsewhere? Why, yes, Dr. Kelly, since you ask. Yes, he does. Firstly, when the annoyingly wise old seer Tiresias refuses to help him, Oedipus goes full Trumpian paranoia. There's a conspiracy to overthrow him. It's all been led by Tiresias, and Creon, for some reason, gets dragged into it. And he even taunts the old bastard for being blind. I mean, really, this is not an attractive man. Then Oedipus summons his cousin Creon, accuses him without any justification at all of being part of this coup, and threatens him with death. Now, there's a bit of a pattern here, and it continues to play out. When the old shepherd who'd saved him initially refuses to confirm Oedipus's identity, he threatens him with torture. Well, one might respond in this last case, as I'm sure some of you want to, particularly my former students who are sitting just there, right? That the Athenians were quite happy to use torture on slaves in legal settings in order to get the truth out of them, somewhat CIA-esque. But let's remember that once he's realised who he is, and who she is, Oedipus bursts into his mother/wife's bedroom with a sword. He's going to kill her, right? So he's an angry man, and this plays a big role in one of the actions for which he suffers, central action. For any good quality he shows, he's still a paranoid dickhead, quick to abuse, even quicker to violence, and with very little sense that he's done anything really wrong. Johnny. Now, the natural corollary here, as we have seen with others of his ilk recently, politics and in life, is that he's also very quick to catastrophize when things go bad. I am the most unholy of men, he whines at the end of the play. I am the most hated by the gods ever, etc., etc. Which all looks very much like claiming to be the victim of the biggest witch hunt in history. Now, Aegean might have disputed his claim, for instance, from his position tied to a wheel of fire, or Sisyphus, if he could have taken a break from pushing that fucking great boulder up a hill. Moreover, though it may not seem to us a fair payment, Oedipus at least has the compensation of being famous, and not just for his family activities. His defeat of the Sphinx was a popular theme in art literature at the time, and the Theban poet Pindar, perhaps the most disgustingly Tory ancient person ever, though to Pindar's credit, at least he's honest about that fact. He never pretends to be anything other than an aristocratic shill. Now, Pindar could praise one of his patrons, who was also another maniac tyrant, because he apparently claimed descent from Oedipus. And even so, the gods allow Oedipus to be honoured with hero cult once he's dead. Several places in Greece claimed that, you would have thought, quite dubious honour, including Athens. And so they're hardly without regard for him or compensating him, paying him back for the things that he suffered during his life. Even then, when Oedipus is at his most desperate and is most reduced, he is still a petulant idiot with enormous levels of self-regard. In short, like Johnny Bairstow, Oedipus is a huge man-child who would be welcomed, perhaps not even really noticed as being all that different, in the current Kool-Aid drinking environment at the England cricket team. He could also, like Johnny Bairstow, have a bad leg, and he's almost bad enough to have come from Yorkshire. For all of those reasons, ditch the bastard.
Thank you, Adrian. That was spoken from the heart. Nothing to say. I want you to ponder those resonances. And whilst you ponder, moving on to our next speaker and our next ditchable candidate. Professor Nisha McSweeney is Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Vienna. Her research, which she'll be embarrassed to say, but I'm going to say it, which has won prizes. So her prize-winning research had focused mainly on migration and identity in the ancient Greek world and the intersection between heritage and modern politics. She's, this wasn't even on her biography, but I'm adding it because I'm a fangirl. She's written a fantastic book on Troy, Troy Myth City Icon, which I think would recommend to everyone who's interested in Troy, and why would you not be interested in Troy? And her most recent book is The West, A New History of an Old Idea. And so Nisha is going to put her enormous talents towards attacking someone who has been both attacked and defended throughout a huge trajectory of mythology and history. Helen of Sparta / Troy / of no fixed abode.
Thank you, fantastic. Am I mic'd up? Do everything? Yep, it's all going well. Fantastic. All right, brilliant. I'm going to start going very quickly because I've got a lot to say. Actually, no, I lie. I've got one thing to say, and that's you should throw Helen overboard without even thinking about the others. And there's one good reason for doing that, right? And it's such a good, strong reason that I'm only going to give you one reason, and I'm not going to say all the obvious reasons because you know all the obvious reasons. Now, if you going to just indulge in a bit of rhetorical praeteritio, but I am not, for example, going to tell you that you should get rid of Helen because of all the people's deaths that she is responsible for. Let's just think about that for a minute, okay? Because not only is there the entire Trojan War that she's responsible for, a whole city destroyed, everybody murdered, sold into slavery, and even the winning side, quite a few of them dead, PTSD, broken homes, a generation torn apart, right? Not only that, but if you believe Herodotus's Persian sources, also the Greco-Persian Wars, that's where it all started. It's a spin-off from the Trojan Wars. It's a continuation of the Trojan Wars. So all the dead of Thermopylae, Salamis, the sacking of Athens, down to Helen, right? And if you were to believe some perhaps quite prominent right-wing kind of thinkers, Samuel Huntington, perhaps if you carry that through into the clash of civilizations over the millennia, you could also see the epic battle of East versus West, Europe versus Asia, through the Crusades, through the War of on Terror and the global jihad. That's a pretty big high body count. Helen, right? That is an epic body count for a truly epic villain. Now, I'm sorry, Oedipus, nowhere even close, my friends. Nowhere even close. And I do want to say on the subject of body count, I know that my esteemed colleagues in a minute are going to start talking about the terrible things that Rome did and imperialism and slavery, but no Rome without Helen, no Rome without the sack of Troy, without Aeneas. So anything bad that you guys are going to say is down to me. But I'm not going to say that because that's too obvious. I'm also not going to talk about why she did this, why she left her loving husband, lovely baby daughter, and eloped and started a war, right? Because it was not obviously, as we know, because she fell in love. Oh, I fell in love. I couldn't, it's Aphrodite's fault. It's not my fault. I fell in love. How old are you? You are not 14. Right? This is a grown woman, a married woman for several years with a child. She should know better than this. So what were her reasons for starting a war? Perhaps 3 reasons. Number 1, greed. As we know from Euripides' Trojan Women, that's the big headline. She wanted the wealth of Troy. She loved the gold. She wanted to flounce about in golden robes all the time. She wanted all the bling that Troy could bring. Number 2, sex, right? This is an older woman. And, I think quite a few of us have been there. You've been married for a while and, maybe things aren't the same as they used to be. And this hot young thing walks into the throne room. And you can kind of understand, maybe she's after a bit on the side. But who does she choose for this? She chooses a vulnerable, impressionable young foreign boy who comes into her house. Now, again, I stress, she's an older woman. She knows what she's doing. This is a boy who has been abandoned by his parents, shipped away. When he finally gets welcomed back into the parental home, he's always second fiddle to his older brother. You'll never be as good as Hector. Right? He is looking for love. He's got serious mummy issues, and she plays on this. Helen is a sexual predator. 3rd reason, and that brings me to the 3rd reason. It's her ego. Again, I keep coming back to this, and there's no reason for this whatsoever, but, I wouldn't know what it's like to be a woman, in your 40s, kind of hanging out with younger, attractive, incredibly intelligent, and incredibly kind of intimidating women. But at some stage, it affects your ego, right? I wouldn't know. Not that I would know that, right? But it's obviously, this is Helen's midlife crisis. Paris is her midlife crisis. And this is her ego trying to get back on top of itself. But I'm not going to talk about that. These are all the things I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to finally get on to the one reason why we should all be throwing Helen off this boat. And that's because she's a bad feminist. Obviously, she basically sabotages the sisterhood, just torpedoes early feminism before it even gets going. First of all, she abandons her daughter. What kind of example is that to set to the next generation, I ask you? Secondly, she's got no care for the suffering of the women around her, those who are going to be killed, their children are going to be killed, they're going to be sold off into sexual slavery and raped. Doesn't give a shite, basically. Doesn't give a shite. But worse than all that, as if that's not bad enough, she also has left us a legacy, and that's why I'm going to be a tiny bit serious for a moment. She's left us a legacy which is basically all the bad things that feminism have had to deal with since then over the millennia. She has promoted and stands for an ideal of womanhood, which is fundamentally terrible. It's passive. This idea of, oh, it wasn't me, it was Aphrodite. I don't own my mistakes. This was somebody else. This is stuff that is done to me. It's a passive image of femininity. And it's an image of femininity where the only thing that's valuable is how sexually attractive you are. And that is incredibly dangerous. And it's caused a lot of suffering over the millennia since Helen supposedly lived. She is not, therefore, the face that launched 1,000 ships. She is the ship that launched 1,000 faces, all of them vacuous, all of them on Instagram, all of them trying to be empty and beautiful as she was. And for that reason, because she is a bad feminist, I think we should throw Helen overboard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. Good feminist being on bad feminist, which is, I think, okay in terms of women not putting down women. I think that's good. Yeah, I think I can never work out the rules, but I think we're good to do that. Incredible, thank you. Are we sitting out of order here?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
we are. Good. Otherwise, I'm a terrible. I'm a Hellenist. I don't really understand what happens in Rome, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong. So, our next passenger. Precarious passenger is Romulus, and our next anti-speaker is Dr. Gail Trimble. Gail is fellow and tutor in classics at Trinity College, Oxford. She, again, important present tense, she is completing, and both Adrian and Gail are being far too modest. She has basically completed another hotly anticipated commentary, this time on an incredible poem from the Latin tradition, Catullus 64. Even as someone who doesn't really like Latin poetry, it's worth a read, and Gail's commentary is going to be amazing. I was going to say epic. And her research in general focuses on Latin poetry, and she's co-edited a volume on metalepsis in classical literature, which my dumb way of explaining it is kind of breaking the fourth wall, right? Yeah. And it's an incredible volume which shines a light on how texts are more self-conscious than we can ever think. And so that's what I want to say about Gail. What I'm going to say in terms of taking Nisha's praeteritio, what I'm not going to say is that she was also, when she was a junior research fellow, graduate student, in fact. Wow. When she was a graduate student, she was briefly famous for her performance on University Challenge. Not going to say that because Gail's moved past that, and so should we. But Gail tonight is going to be talking about an arguably just as famous personnel, a certain guy called Romulus. So thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Emma. I'm also going to do a thing where I say, can you hear me? I can hear that I'm being heard, so that's fantastic. So I am speaking about somebody, of course, who gave his name to a whole people. So again, I could do praeteritio and I could start saying it's about the Romans, but it's not about the Romans, okay? Because the Romans are controversial. I quite like the Romans. A lot of people don't. You can be for or against the Romans. You can think about all the things that the Romans did for us, the aqueducts, the roads, the poetry. Or you can think about the things the Romans did for us, the imperialism, the slavery, the endlessly dull analytic history. But I'm not going to do that because, unlike Nisha perhaps, I am a bit scared of the space-time continuum. I am not going to suggest such a fundamental intervention in history as actually getting rid of the Romans when we throw the founder of Rome overboard, because you never know where that sort of thing might lead. Okay, we might all just disappear in a puff of logic, and I would not want that to happen. So as you will see, we can still have all the good things about the Romans in one form or another. Instead, I'm going to talk about Romulus himself. So, I mean, as ever, there are some fuzzy parts of this story, but let me remind you that it goes something like this.
we start with what I'm going to call a bit of court politics in the royal family of, a small town, probably about the size of this building in terms of the number of people who are in it all day, in the middle of Italy, called Alba Longa. So somebody called Amulius steals, again, what I am comedy going to call the throne from his brother, kills his brother's sons, and makes his brother's daughter a sacred Vestal Virgin. She becomes pregnant anyway. The father being, apparently, Mars. But this doesn't impress Amulius, who decides to expose her child to die, which is obviously the regular ancient reflex in various situations, as we've already seen a couple of times. But of course, it isn't one child, it's twins. I'm not sure if I should or shouldn't mention at this point that I am the mother of twins myself. Anyway, she gives birth to twins. Okay, right, fine. A bit harder work, but they're going to be exposed. Twin boys, Romulus and Remus. And of course, these twin boys, exposed on the banks of the Tiber, don't die. They are rescued by a wolf and or some shepherds. I thought I was going to get the picture of the wolf, so you just have to imagine your favourite picture of a wolf made of bronze or mosaic or something as normally portrayed, with two tiny boys underneath trying to find them all. Anyway, these boys, having started like this, grow up living a wild and energetic life in the Italian countryside, so rather idyllic. And as soon as they're old enough, of course, they take revenge on their great uncle, Amulius, and give the throne back to their grandfather, and they cooperate beautifully in order to do so, and everything's fine in Alba Longa. So far, so fairy tale. But being exceptionally energetic young men, they remind me of some of my students at this point. Just, calm down, calm down. They decide that for an encore, they will found a city of their own on the banks of the Tiber, where they'd grown up. And this is where things suddenly go extremely wrong. So it's a beautiful day on the hills by the Tiber. And Romulus and Remus and their friends are building walls. Sounds like a good way to start founding a city. Let's build some walls. There are birds flying around, and they're trying to remember what somebody once told them about augury, and they weren't really concentrating. And Remus is the first to say that he's seen 6 vultures. Romulus says, I've seen 12. I saw them first, says Remus. I saw more, says Romulus. Does it even matter, says Remus. Well, it's a hot day. Tempers are fraying. They're young brothers. Perhaps they are beginning to realise that founding a city might involve a bit more than just building a wall. So they get on with their work. And after a while, Remus, who has had a chance to calm down by this point, wonders if maybe they should stop for lunch. So he comes over to suggest it to Romulus, who is digging foundations. And in between the brothers is Romulus's half-built wall. Romulus is digging. Remus reaches out a hand, vaults over it, and Romulus swings his spade into his brother's face and kills him. Just think about that moment for a bit. So from this point on, Romulus continues to be an extremely violent young man, but he directs his violence into making sure that the group of other violent young men that he's gathering around him continue to be more successfully violent than everyone else, setting up the paradigm that would get the Romans where they got to. And I mean, we can accept, I think, that Italy in the 8th century BC was a difficult world to make your way in. You may not have much of a taste for warlords, but I'm sure we can accept that being an effective warlord might sometimes just be what you need to be. That's not really my problem with Romulus. I am also not going to say the thing that if I were a classical Roman, I would definitely say at this point, which would be to make the extremely snobbish point that Romulus hung out with some strange types, and all the people he gathered around him at this point, I mean, shepherds. I mean, what's wrong with shepherds? That all sounds fine to me. Criminals? outlaws, people no city would take in. Well, I'm not sure this is coming from an unbiased source, that kind of point. I do think we should take seriously another fact, which is, of course, that when he wanted to turn this group of violent young men into a more settled community, presumably the walls had got a bit higher by this point, Romulus didn't do this in a normal sort of way of sort of making friends with any of the local people. Instead, he decided to go to the whole palaver of arranging a local sporting fixture with the neighbouring Sabines, sort of family day out, bring your children. And of course, he used this as the stage for a mass abduction of schoolgirls. However, with the continuum of ancient history in mind, what I would particularly like to emphasise is that apart from all the other people he may have killed, Romulus definitely murdered his brother. And there isn't any way of getting round this. This building site rage is even worse than Oedipus's road rage. So because of a joke, thoughtlessly in the sunshine, Romulus murdered his closest companion, the person he'd spent his whole life with, his twin, the whole time together, even when everyone else in their family had 4 legs. Now, there are, I'm always alive to the nuances of the sources, there are, of course, some versions that say that this murder was somehow an accident. That there was a bit of a general scuffle and Remus was somehow in the wrong place at the wrong time and got a spade in the face that way. That Romulus wasn't there, this is Ovid's version, and was devastated when he found out. Okay, so is fratricide just the sort of thing you need to do to achieve success in the ancient world, or particularly sort of the very archaic Roman world? I don't think so, actually. And the reason I say that with some confidence is because the gods did not think so. They agreed that there is something particularly depraved about killing your brother. How do we know that? Well, because Romulus managed to leave the people that he founded and gave his name to with the curse of repeated civil war. Now, all Romans knew this. They kept hoping it would go away, but it didn't. Here we go again, said Virgil. And Horace. And again, a century after their time in the year of the 4 emperors, the ancient crime is rearing its ugly head again. The state is tearing itself apart, and of course, more brothers are actually killing their brothers. So I think the Romans might have achieved so much more without being cursed to repeat what their fratricidal founder had done on a hot day on the Palatine Hill, when he'd dug Remus's blood into the foundations of the city with that spade. Now, as I said, I'm sure many of you would be willing to take or leave the Romans, and perhaps some of you would be quite relieved that they weren't any more powerful and successful than they were. But I'd like to suggest that if you throw Romulus overboard, they wouldn't have been the Romans. They'd have been the Remans. With no Romulus, there is no fratricide. There are no twins, just one child. Remus founds the city on the hills by the Tiber. The whole of Reman history develops along, perhaps similar space-time continuum, but I think rather more civilized lines. And the world is a better place.
Thank you so much, Gail. And if and when I ever meet your twins, I will not tell them that you've just spent your evening pitching to the world a utopian vision of when there was only one twin. To round up the, I was going to say the formal part of this evening, but let's be real, the speech part of this evening, with our latest figure chronologically, in terms of the ancient world, I think. Hadrian, the emperor being spoken against by Professor Tim Whitmarsh, who is the Regius Professor of Greek at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Trinity College. Tim has published equally widely, as I've used the word widely very much tonight, but it's true, on Greek literature and culture in a huge number of respects, including his book that I'm sure many of you know, Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World. Atheism is a thing in the ancient world, is the kind of TLDR, and it's worth reading that thesis in full. And also a huge number of other books that I will not reel off here. And apparently over 100 articles, which is a statistic I didn't want to know. But I think Tim's greatest achievement, as I'm sure he'd agree, is he was my PhD supervisor. And Tim is also the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Classical Dictionary, which is, the way I think about it, is just the better, more cerebral and more accurate version of Wiki. And it should be everyone's first port of call if you want to know anything about anyone or anything, literally. And so tonight, Tim is battling not the gods, well, no, but a kind of semi-god. He's battling against not a god, but an emperor, Hadrian. Thank you, Tim.
Why Hadrian? Well, let's bring some Roman practicality to these discussions. This is a boat, isn't it? It's in danger of sinking. There are two reasons why it's in danger of sinking. One is because it's drawing water on board, and the other is because there are heavy beings on it. Now, mythical beings, I'm afraid, don't actually weigh anything. Hadrian is the only person who's dragging this boat down. And I'll tell you one other thing also. They all weigh nothing. They are lightweights to the extent of not weighing anything. But one of them weighs less than nothing because he's pulled his eyes out. He's actually pulling the boat upwards. So for a start, vote to throw a real person off. As I say, it's just a Roman solution to this. But beyond that, why Hadrian himself? You might be thinking this is quite a cookie choice. Hadrian, musician, poet, lover, builder, inspirer, creator of a century of peace. The list goes on and on. Hadrian is very widely thought of, very well thought of in contemporary culture in all sorts of ways. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the way in which that myth was created and the damaging effects of that kind of mythologizing, and in particular the damaging effect of that kind of role of classics, because that's what we're here for today, really, is to think about why classics is for all and it's not really for these sort of parlous effects that are exploited by terrible people like Hadrian. So Hadrian was not the figure that we think he is. He was a fraud. He was a killer. He was an awful self-promoter. He was a narcissist. He was evil. Do you know what happened on the 8th of August, 117? I'm not going anywhere till someone tells me. Gail will know.
It's in the river.
Fired. On the 8th of August, 117, the Emperor Trajan died. Okay, he died without an heir. Okay, so who's going to be the next emperor? Well, you know, it's a bit of a crisis situation because, as I say, what normally happens is that even if you haven't got an offspring of your own, you inherit someone before you die so that that person can, if you like, sort of be the continuation. 8th of August, 117, Trajan dies. 9th of August, 117, Hadrian is adopted by Trajan. The day after Trajan dies, something funny is going on there. And that cookiness follows Hadrian through all of his career. He says, the first thing he says on being becoming emperor is that I'm not going to kill any senators. No, I mean, for a start, you know, I'm not going to kill any senators. You know, that's a pretty weird thing to lead with, isn't it? Like, we didn't think you were, you know, what? Why say it then? But you can see where this story is going. It doesn't actually last very well. He goes on a turbocharged killing spree. Why do I call it a turbocharged killing spree? Because the guy that led the killing spree, his name was Turbo, yeah, exactly, yes. Spelt like the turbocharged rather than the turbot fish, just to be clear there. Yeah, so he immediately reneges on his claim not to kill any senators. Essentially what happens when he comes to power is that he starts hacking away at Trajan's favourite people, including governors of provinces and people who run armies and that sort of thing. And the place goes into absolute chaos. There are uprisings, there are all sorts of disturbances all over the empire. So what he does then is he appoints Turbo to, amongst other things, to try and pacify. And we know what the Romans mean by pacify. It's not nice. It doesn't mean make it peaceful. It means apply an awful lot of violence so that it's slightly less disturbed than it was in the first place. So turbocharged killing spree, and unfortunately, Turbo himself came to a bad end in the course of Hadrian's reign because he was so fickle and so, all these paranoid people, they always turn on the people who support them. And that's what he did with Turbo himself. But to be serious, because we do have to be serious about these things, because he was a massive killer. The thing that he's best known for in terms of the really awful things that he did was to massacre Jews. Okay, so if we were having this conversation in Israel, there would be no question about who was the most awful person in this, because everyone in Israel knows about the murderous rampage that Hadrian propelled. There was a Jewish revolt in 116, just before he somehow became emperor. There was another one in 132 AD, just after, in 130, Hadrian went to Israel and he founded a new city on the site of Jerusalem, and he called it Aelia Capitolina. So the Capitolina bit means sort of capital and to do with Julius Capitolinus, and the Aelia bit is named after himself. Okay, he's Aelius Hadrianus. Okay, so it's not a very nice thing to do to people who believe in the sacred site. They believe that the temple is the center of God's power. Okay. The temple is already lying in ruins, of course, because the Romans trashed it in 70 AD anyway. So it's a massively culturally insensitive thing to do. Or to put another way around, it's pacifying. It's sort of doing what Romans do when they make the world a better place. It's sort of imposing Roman will onto the landscape. So it was a catastrophic thing to do, and it created the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD. Hadrian's response to this was to send his men through what is now Israel, what was Judea then at the time. And the figures that we have are absolutely shocking. 985 villages and 500,000 people in the military alone. So this is remembered in Jewish history as one of the most awful events in a history that has a lot of very awful events in it. So as I say, that's the serious bit. I'm not going to be serious for the rest of this talk, don't worry, but there is a real claim here that Hadrian is deeply, to use that word again, evil. Now, why is this important for us to think about today? It's precisely because of this mismatch between the perception of Hadrian as this nice, cuddly, artistic sort of lover man and the reality of what he did in his life. This cuts to the quick of the role of classics in modern society. Hadrian was a relentless self-publicist. We have a story, which is a wonderful story, that he wrote 4 biographies of, guess who? Hadrian, yeah. And he told his freedmen to publish these under their own name. And of course, you don't get a lot of option to say, oh, no, I don't really fancy that or whatever. It's going to affect my, my perception in the public sphere. The literary world they won't like the adjustment of style from my last book. You can't say any of that. You have to go with it. So he was somebody who was absolutely dedicated to using literature to adorn himself, to, if you like, to mask over the horror of what he was actually doing in his political world, in his military world. He wasn't even that smart. there's an amazing story about the sophist Favorinus. Now, this is an era when educated Greek men, and Favorinus was a Gaul, but he was sort of educated in Greek as well. Educated Greek men had a rather niche hobby, and this hobby was declaiming oratory in the style of people from the past, or the alleged style. They would sort of stand up and say, I'm Alexander the Great before the Battle of Granicus, and I will give you a speech here. And they had to do it using the dialect and the language and the vocab and the morphology of the language at the time. So it was doubly difficult, but it was great fun. They had a lot of fun doing it. Now, Favorinus did this. Try it later. This is absolutely, wonderful. Anyway, Favorinus does this. He's an expert in this. He's, as I say, he's from Gaul. He speaks 3 languages, but he's equally competent in all of them, and he smashes it. He smashes it out of the park. But Hadrian is in the audience, and Hadrian says, "Oh no, you used a word that is anachronistic that they wouldn't have used at the time." And afterwards, and Favorinus goes, "Oh yes, I'm terribly sorry. How could I?" And afterwards, his friends go up to him and say, "Why did you let him get away with that? That word is perfectly legitimate. It's found in Xenophon. It's found in Demosthenes. Found in blah blah blah." And Favorinus comes up with this wonderful bon mot, which is that you cannot persuade me that the most learned man in the room was not the man who commands 30 legions. And that really gets to the core of what is going on with these sort of dynamics. When Hadrian hangs around and pretends to be sort of super intellectual, which he is not, pretends to be super intellectual, everyone knows that it's masking a power game. Okay, so it was a disastrous reign. It was a chaotic reign. He used classical learning to cover over those tracks. There are some modern parallels here. It would be very crude to draw these. I'm not going to go there, but as I say, there are 1 or 2 modern parallels there. He was a builder. He did do lots of prettifying of these places, but of course he wasn't the builder. He just told other people to build things. And if you're thinking about Hadrian's Wall as one of the things that, amazing tourist attraction, a great bit of heritage, Roman heritage, whatever, fantastic, but it's a wall. It's a divisive wall. Build that wall. Again, another phrase that echoes down through the ages. Wall builders are not good people. They're divisive people. If you think about, the wall in Berlin, in Jerusalem, or whatever, all of these places, what they're doing is bad things. They're cutting people apart. So we need to remember that building is actually, amongst other things, it's dominating the landscape. It's putting things there where they weren't before. It's using material resources, taking them from the earth, and creating divisions amongst human beings. Now, the elephant in the room, if you like, for Hadrian is the figure of Antinous, his young lover, who died in the 130s in a tragic accident that we don't know very much about. And Hadrian spent much of the rest of the 130s lamenting for the death of Antinous. And of course, it's been a very powerful story in all sorts of ways. In terms of enabling gay rights. It is a moment in the history of gay rights. But Antinous was 12 when Hadrian met him in 123 BCE. CE. Very old. He was 12 at the time, and he was 18 when he died. So this is a very young man who didn't get to live very much of his life. And as I say, we don't know very much about the circumstances of his death, but it seems to be connected to a hunting expedition, perhaps a lion hunting expedition in Egypt at the time. Hadrian was an obsessive hunter, so he takes a young boy hunting with him. The guy dies, maybe he drowns, maybe he's mauled by a lion. We don't really know the full story there. Hadrian mythologizes what he's doing, because that's what he always does. He always creates this sort of aesthetic veneer over the surface of it. Lots of statues everywhere, names a city after him, Antinopolis. But actually the reality of it is that this was a young boy who didn't get to enjoy very much of his life before he died. And this itself is not a very helpful enabling mythology, even for gay rights. If you think about the trope "bury your gays," which was a sort of TV trope, which is where the young gay guy usually dies early in the series. They're the expendable kind of characters. That's sort of the narrative. That's the vibe that we're getting out of this. So the real question is, what do we want classics to be? Do we want to be something that enables narcissists, that enables killers, that enables, yes, again, it would be crude to bring in those resonances, but do we want it to be that kind of thing? Or do we want it to be something that in the world that we live in at the moment, which needs the love and the care and the attention that it deserves, and the inhabitants of that world, whether humans or animals or whatever, also need that love, attention and care and deserve. Classics can be that. Or it can be the other thing. It can be the excuse, the alibi for terrible people. That's why you must throw Hadrian off this boat.
Thank you so much, Tim. And this is just to do a sort of brief handover to the handover. So I'll now, this is a debate that we've laughed a lot and thought a lot. And I'm now going to hand you over to Jimmy, who's going to control that thought and laughter into democratic action.
Are we going to have one final comment?
Oh, we can. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. So let's, one final elevator pitch plea for those who wish to take it.
Okay.
In terms of why.
Right. Just to deal with my colleagues here, start off with Tim. How heavy do you think Oedipus's eyes are, mate?
Pretty heavy.
Pretty fucking big, huh? Okay. Gail, I was going to say, children, when they fight, they often don't realise the extent of violence. Oedipus, of course, knew very well what violence, but anyway, so, and Nisha, there were various times I couldn't tell whether you were being as misogynist as the scholars that I grew up reading, but clearly not, and that's not a fight that I'm going to have. Oedipus is still, I think, a dreadful, dreadful guy. Obviously, Tim's actually pulls the heartstrings a little bit more. But I think the really crucial thing is that Oedipus, if Helen, for instance, is to blame for lots of these anti-feminist tropes, Oedipus is to blame for the notion that all modern Greeks are related. That's a heavy word. You get rid of him, you get rid of that. The history of the European Union is a much more positive.
Right, I'm going to say.
Now set a precedent for having to clap after everyone.
Oh, right, okay.
So, Nisha.
I'm going to be very, very brief. I ignore everything that I said initially. I think I'm going to go with body count because I definitely outweigh all of you. If mythological body count as well as actual body count. It's a lot of bodies, it's a lot of weight. Will definitely relieve the boat. So I think let's go with body count. Let's go with Helen. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that I was very offended at being called mythical.
I didn't call you.
I know. Having my
You're
victim
legendary, but not mythical.
being called mythical. Exactly. Well, legendary maybe, but I think not mythical. That's not fair. Look at the name, Romulus, Rome. So, on which note, of course, I think the answer is don't throw overboard somebody like Oedipus, who was just a nasty man. Don't throw overboard a symbol like Hadrian, who will be replaced by somebody equally awful, frankly, in that century. And don't risk the space-time continuum. Don't undo the whole of ancient history. Make it better. Transform the Romans into the Remans. Thank you.
Facial amnesia is terrible.
Yes, I've got two things to say. I'll be very quick.
Oh.
That's number one. Second, the name Adrian.
That was fantastic. I can have another big round of applause for everybody. Oh my God. Good. Well, if you'd have been around in Cambridge in the 70s, I'd have turned up for lectures. Right, so now we get down to the point of the evening, the voting. It's very serious, a bit like Eurovision. Online, are you ready? So I don't know how to do this. Should we do it by cheering or by show of hands? Do you feel better with show of hands? I think so. Be a bit reckless to cheer, wouldn't it? So can we have a show of hands if you would like Oedipus to be cast out of the boat? Show of hands for Oedipus.
Oh, come on.
You got one.
That's my daughter.
That's your daughter.
That's my daughter.
So, I think that's
And not my wife.
English people, got it.
I think you went out on a limb with the whole Johnny Bairstow. It was very brave, by the way, but slightly suicidal. So, hands up now if you would like Helen to be thrown out the boat. Oh, okay. So, one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Take that.
25 votes for Helen. Okay, it's hotting up. Oedipus, you're still in with it. No, you're not.
My former student who didn't even.
Well, thereby hangs the tale. So, can we now cast your votes for the killer of Remus, Romulus? It's interesting. It's a tight run thing. 1, 2, 17, 18, 19. Yeah, roughly right. 19. So 25 plays 19 plays. I'm not going to mention one.
Two.
Two. Sorry. I didn't.
Very good people.
Sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. Tim. I'll leave that to the rest of them. So, finally, who would like Hadrian to be shoved into the water?
No double voting. We should have said.
I totally vote off it.
16, 17, 18, 19,
Hadrian's
20,
got it.
22, 25, 26, 27, 28,
Oh, there it is.
31.
There it is.
I think Fat Boy Hadrian is going over the side. So the winner tonight is Presenter Weber. And we have the votes in from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan. Can we have your votes, Azerbaijan?
Helen.
Helen won it all line. So a bit like American democracy. Hadrian won the popular vote and Helen won the electoral college. So that was a fantastic, thank you so much. That was a really, really wonderful evening. I just want to wrap it up by saying other thanks. I'd like to thank the Classics for All team, and that's Christina Choi and Nikita Salt, Annabelle and Jules Mann. Thank you very much. They've done a great job tonight, I think. You'll agree, by organising this whole thing. I want to thank Linklaters. I am going to forget somebody, but never mind. And I'd like to thank Linklaters again for this. This is a great venue, perfect venue for this kind of event. Thank you very much. And Jamie Wotton, thank you again. And some other thanks to our old friends who've come along this evening, which is great. And some new friends. We have actually brand new friends brought along by their teacher, Harley Aston. They're studying ancient history. Introduced by Classics for All, and they are at the Hemel Hempstead School. Let's hear it for them. And we've got the Cicero moot trial coming up, I think, soon. So do come along and join us for that. I can't think of anybody else I need to thank. Have I forgotten anybody, Jules? Okay. And again, I would love to thank Emma Greensmith for organising this and our 4 stars from the Classics world. Please give it up a minute. Go and have some drinks.
Oh, congratulations, Tim.
Well.
Fine case.